Some people you only understand after they've saved your life. And even then, you spend the rest of your years pretending you understood them all along. I'm an old man now, and I've buried more friends than I've kept. But there's one winter I've never been able to set down. Folks around here call it the Long White. We don't say much else about it, because to talk about that storm honestly, you'd have to admit what we were before it came. And what we were was a town full of people who laughed at a grieving woman for digging holes in her yard. We thought she was mad. We thought she was throwing her dead husband's money into the dirt. We made jokes at the feed store. We let our children point. And then the sky turned the color of a dead fire, and the wind came down off the divide like the hand of God, and the only warm light left in 40 miles of frozen dark was burning behind her crooked stone walls. This is the story of Marin Vance, and the garden we called her Folly. I'm telling it the way I should have told it 40 years ago, slow and ashamed and grateful. Stay with me. By the end you'll know why I still leave a lantern burning in my window every February, even though there's no one left out there to see it. The first thing I remember is the silence breaking. It was the 17th of February, and I was standing in my barn with a dead heifer at my feet, and a wind starting to talk in the rafters. That low, conversational moan a building makes when the air outside is deciding whether to kill you. I had a lantern hung on a nail and my hands stuffed in my armpits, and I was doing what I always did when the world got too big for me. I was counting. 43 head of cattle, 12 still standing in the south pasture, 31 I'd already moved into the lower barn, one dead at my boots, her breath gone to frost on the straw. I count things. My late wife, Lottie, used to say I'd count the stars down out of the sky if grief gave me a tall enough ladder. She wasn't wrong. When you can't fix a thing, you measure it. It feels like control. It isn't, but it feels like it, and most days the feeling is all a man's got. I had a brass coat button in my coat pocket, hers, and I was rolling it between my thumb and forefinger the way some men work a bit of rosary. I didn't pray much anymore, but I rubbed that button smooth as a river stone, and I suppose that was its own kind of asking. The wind shifted. I heard it change its mind out there, heard the temperature drop the way you can sometimes hear it in high country, a tightening, like the whole valley clenching its jaw. I went to the barn door and pushed it open against the gust and looked out at the sky, and that was when the cold reached down my collar and took hold of my spine. The clouds weren't gray. They were the wrong color entirely, a yellow-brown bruise rolling down off the divide, the bottom of it dragging snow already, a curtain of it, gray-white and solid as a wall, eating the foothills one ridge at a time. I'd lived in Harrow Creek 51 years. I'd seen blizzards put 4 feet down in a night. I'd seen a man freeze to death walking from his house to his woodpile because he got turned around in the white. I had never, not once, seen the sky look like that. Lord, I said out loud to nobody. And then, because counting is the only prayer I know, I started doing the arithmetic of the storm. How much wood I had stacked? How much hay? How many days the cattle could stand it? How long before the road to town closed? How long before the power lines came down, and they would come down because they always did, every hard winter, and Harrow Creek would go dark and quiet, and every household would become its own small island, fighting alone. That's the thing about a real blizzard. It doesn't just freeze you. It separates you. It cuts every rope between every house until there's nothing but you and your stove and your prayers, and you find out in a hurry exactly how much you laid by, and exactly how much of a fool you'd been all autumn when the sun was warm and laying by felt like wasted afternoons. I stood there with the wind taking the heat off my face, and I thought, we are not ready. And then, and I am ashamed of this, because it tells you what kind of man I was, the very next thing I thought was, she is. You have to understand what Marin Vance's place looked like, or none of the rest makes sense. Tomas Vance died 2 winters before the Long White. He was a quarryman, a big quiet Czech with forearms like fence posts and a laugh you could hear across the valley, and he died the way quarrymen die, which is suddenly and underneath something. A shelf of granite let go on a cold morning, and that was the end of Tomas. They brought him down the mountain on a flatbed with a tarp over him, and Marin met them at the gate of the little house on the Bellwether Road, and she didn't scream. I was there. Half the town was there. We expected screaming. Instead, she just put one hand flat against the side of the truck, against the cold metal like she was steadying it, or steadying herself, or saying goodbye to him through 3 layers of Detroit steel. Then she went inside and shut the door, and we didn't see her for the better part of a month. When we did see her again, she'd started digging. At first, nobody thought much of it. A widow in her grief, turning over a garden, that's a thing women do, we told ourselves. Honest work. Keeps the mind off the empty side of the bed. My Lottie had planted half an acre of irises the spring after our boy died, and I'd understood that, the way you understand a person needs to put their hands in something that grows when the thing they loved has stopped growing forever. But Marin Vance didn't plant irises. She dug pits, deep ones 8 foot down, square and tidy, and she lined the walls with stone she hauled herself in a handcart from the old quarry tailings, Tomas's quarry, though none of us made that connection then, fool that we were. She built walls. Not fences, walls, low ones, curving, made of fieldstone and mortar, and they didn't go in straight lines or square corners like a sane person's walls. They curled. They spiraled. They came up out of the ground in long, sweeping arcs that didn't enclose anything you could name, didn't keep anything in or out that we could see. From the Bellwether Road, her yard looked like the bones of something, like a half-built cathedral with no roof and no walls and no point. She dug a great slope trench on the south side of her house and roofed part of it, just part, with old window glass she'd bought up cheap from the Hendry place when they tore down the schoolhouse. Dozens of mismatched panes set into a frame angled low against the southern sky, so that the whole contraption looked like a greenhouse that had sunk halfway into the earth and given up. She filled the inside with black-painted barrels, water barrels, just sitting there, doing nothing, far as anyone could tell. She raised the beds into long curving mounds with little pockets and hollows cut into their south faces, and on the north of every mound she stacked more stone, and she planted, God help us, she planted in October. Kale and chard and some squat hard cabbages and roots I didn't know the names of, going into the ground when every farmer in the valley was pulling the last of his out. She built a chicken coop dug half into the hillside and banked with earth, with a little run that opened into the warmest pocket of the spiral, where the walls cupped the winter sun like 2 hands holding a coal. And she dug a cistern, a big one, plastered, fed by every gutter and every low channel in that strange curling landscape, so that all the snowmelt and rain that fell anywhere on her acre ran downhill through her crooked stone veins and collected in one cold belly underground. It made no sense to us, none of it. It wasn't a farm and it wasn't a garden, and it sure as hell wasn't pretty. It looked like the work of a woman whose grief had gone sideways into her hands and come out as madness. And we are not, I'm sorry to say, a kind people when we're frightened. And a thing we don't understand frightens us more than a thing that wants to kill us. So we laughed. The laughing started gentle, the way cruelty usually does, dressed up as concern. Somebody ought to check on the Vance woman, they'd say at the feed store, shaking their heads. Digging her own grave out there, looks like. And then somebody would chuckle, and somebody else would chuckle, and pretty soon it wasn't concern at all, it was just sport. They called it Vance's folly, then just the folly, the maze, the crazy quilt. Earl Dorsey, who ran the feed store and had never in his life had an original thought he didn't borrow from somebody meaner, took to calling it the Gopher Farm on account of all the holes, and that one stuck. And it stuck because it was cruel and easy, and let us all feel like the sane ones. I want to tell you I didn't join in, I want to tell you that. But the truth is I was at the feed store one afternoon in November, buying twine, and Earl said something, I don't even remember what, something about Marin out there planting cabbage for the worms, and the whole counter laughed, and I laughed too. I laughed because it was easier than not laughing. I laughed because Lottie was 3 years gone and I was a lonely, hard old man, and there is a particular comfort, a poison comfort, in standing in a warm room full of laughing people and pointing at the one soul standing out in the cold alone. It makes you feel like you're on the right side of something. She came and not 5 minutes later. I'll carry that the rest of my days. She came in her dead husband's canvas coat with the sleeves rolled 3 times, snow melting in her dark hair, a list in her chapped hand, and the whole store went quiet the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has just been laughing at the person who walked in. She knew. Of course she knew. You don't survive in a small town without learning the exact texture of a silence that was your name a moment before. She bought her nails and her lime and her chicken feed, and she counted out her coins on the counter one at a time, and Earl took them without a word. And on her way out she stopped, right next to me, close enough I could smell the wood smoke and cold earth on her, and she looked up at me. She was a small woman. I'd forgotten how small. Her eyes were the gray of a sky that hasn't decided yet. "You knew Tomas," she said, quiet just to me. "I did," I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant it. "He was a good man." "He was." She looked at me a moment longer. Not angry. That's what I couldn't stand. If she'd been angry, I could have gotten my back up and stayed the fool I was. But she just looked at me like she was reading something written small on my face, and then she said, "He always said you were smarter than you let on, Wade Coltrane." And she went out into the cold. I didn't buy my twine after all. I left it on the counter and I drove home, and I sat in my dark kitchen for a long time with Lottie's button in my fist. Smarter than you let on. The hell of it is, Tomas had said that to me too once years back, half drunk at the harvest dance, his big arm around my neck. "You see things, Wade, you count things. You just won't say what they add up to." I'd laughed it off then too. I drove past her place on the way to town a few days later, slowed the truck without quite meaning to. She was out in the cold building one of those curving walls, working a stone into place with her bare hands, her breath smoking, and behind her the low glass roof of her sunken greenhouse caught the late sun and threw it back gold. And inside, I swear to you, inside it was green. In November, in Harrow Creek. There were green leaves standing up behind that glass, while the rest of the valley was brown and dead and waiting for the snow. I should have stopped. I should have gotten out of the truck and walked up that crooked path and said, "Marin, what is this? Show me, teach me." I had the question in my mouth. I drove on, because the men at the feed store would have heard about it, because a man my age doesn't go to school on a widow's mad garden, because pride is the cheapest thing in the world and will pay anything for it. I drove on, and the snow came 3 months later, and by then it was almost too late for all of us. Almost. That 17th of February, standing in my barn door watching that wrong-colored sky come down off the divide, I knew it was going to be bad in a way our usual winters weren't. I could feel it in my back teeth. I got the south pasture cattle in, the 12 of them, stumbling and bawling, the snow already coming sideways by the time I got the last one through the gate, my hands so cold on the latch I had to look at them to be sure they were closed. I forked down extra hay. I checked the stove in the house. I brought in 3 days of wood, then thought better of it and brought in 3 more. And then the lines came down. I heard it, that flat whump somewhere out past the Dorsey place, and then the kitchen light I'd left on went out, and the refrigerator stopped its humming, and the whole house settled into that deep, powerless quiet that means you are now alone with whatever you laid by. I lit the lamps. I banked the stove. I sat down at my kitchen table with my ledger and my pencil, and I started to count, because that is what I do, and I counted wood and water and food and days, and somewhere around the 3rd column the arithmetic stopped reassuring me and started telling me the truth. I had maybe a week. If the storm broke in a week, I'd live, and most of my cattle would live, and we'd all come out the far side thinner and meaner and alive. But the wind outside wasn't talking like a week. It was screaming now, a single unbroken note, and the snow had gone from falling to flying, horizontal, The window beside me already drifted halfway up its glass. And I thought of the old-timer stories, the ones I'd half believed, the winter of '88, the 3-week white, the families they found in the spring still sitting at their tables. I thought, what if it doesn't break in a week? And I thought of Marin Vance, alone on the Bellwether Road in her dead husband's coat, behind her crooked stone walls and her sunken glass, with her green leaves standing up in the dark, and her black barrels full of God knew what, and her cistern belly full of water under the frozen ground. I'd called her a fool, we all had. But sitting there in my cold, powerless kitchen, doing the only kind of prayer I know, I started to understand that there is more than one way to lay by for winter. And the woman we'd laughed at had spent 2 years, 2 grieving, mocked, solitary years, building the only thing in this valley that wasn't about to start dying. The wind hit the house then, a gust so hard the whole structure groaned and the lamp flames laid down flat and I felt the floor shudder under my boots. Outside, the dark came down complete. No stars, no moon, no light anywhere in the whole frozen world. Except when I went to the window and scrubbed the frost away with the heel of my hand and looked east, toward the Bellwether Road, 3/4 of a mile across the buried fields. There was one. A small, steady, golden light, low to the ground, burning behind glass and stone, unbothered by the wind that was tearing my world to pieces. The Gopher Farm, the Folly, the Maze. Burning, warm in the dark like it had been waiting 2 years for exactly this night. I put my forehead against the cold glass, and I watched that light and something in my chest came loose that I'd had clamped down tight since the day they brought Tomas down the mountain under a tarp. Maybe longer, maybe since Lottie. I didn't know yet what that light would cost. I didn't know what she'd already decided, alone out there, or what I'd have to walk through the white to find out, or who else in this valley was going to come crawling toward that glow before the long white was through with us. I only knew I'd been wrong, about all of it. And I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has just watched the easy world end, that before this storm was over, every one of us who'd laughed was going to need that woman. The question was whether she'd open the door. I don't know how else to say it. A town is the ropes between the houses, the woman who brings soup when you're sick, the man who plows your lane when you can't, the kid who runs your eggs to market. The blizzard cut every one of those ropes the first night and didn't give them back. By the 3rd day, each house was its own frozen planet, and the people inside them were finding out, in the dark, exactly what they were made of. I found out I was made of less than I'd hoped, and more than I'd feared. The cattle started dying on the 2nd night. Cold like that gets into the lungs of the weak ones first, the old cow, the late calf, and you hear it before you see it. A wet rattling cough out in the dark of the barn. And then in the morning there's one down in the straw that won't get up, eyes already gone to ice. I lost 4 head in 2 days. I dragged each one out into the drift behind the barn because I couldn't stand to have them in there with the living, and the cold took them so fast they were stiff as cordwood before I'd hauled them 10 feet. I counted what was left. I always count. 39. Then 37. The numbers were the only honest thing in the house, and they were telling me I was losing. I was rationing wood by then. Burning it in the kitchen stove only, the rest of the house shut off and gone to a cold that frosted the insides of the windows in feather patterns Lottie would have loved. I slept in the kitchen in my coat with the dog, Old Pim, a blue heeler going gray at the muzzle, pressed against my side, both of us stealing each other's heat. I ate cold beans from the can because I couldn't spare the fire to warm them. I rubbed Lottie's button raw between my fingers in the long dark hours when the wind told its one endless story against the walls. And every night I looked east, and every night the light was burning. Steady, warm, golden, 3/4 of a mile across the buried fields, behind the crooked walls of the garden we'd laughed at. I'd watch it the way a drowning man watches a far shore, not believing he can reach it, just needing to know it's there. Some nights I'd see a smaller light moving across the yard, lantern-sized, low to the ground, and I'd know it was her, out in the killing cold, doing her chores, alive in a way the rest of us were only barely managing. I started doing arithmetic I didn't like. Here is the arithmetic. The Prout place lay between mine and hers, half a mile out on the Bellwether Road. Del Prout and his wife Cora had a baby, born in the fall, their first, a little girl they'd named after Cora's mother. Del ran a few sheep and worked the gravel pit in summer, and they were poor the way young couples are poor, which is to say they had heart and no margin. They had a wood stove and not much wood. They had a baby and a hard winter and no laying by, because they were young and the autumn had been kind, and they'd believed, the way the young believe, that the kindness would last. On the third night, I saw a thing that made the arithmetic stop being a thing in my head and start being a thing I had to do. I saw the light in the Prout place go out. Not the flicker of a lamp turned down. Out. All at once, both windows, the way a fire goes when the last of the wood is gone and there's no more, and the dark that came after it was a different dark than the cold dark of the storm. It was the dark of a house that has stopped fighting. I stood at my window with my forehead against the freezing glass, and I said out loud, no, just that, to the storm, to God, to myself, no. And then I did the thing I am most ashamed of in this whole telling, and also, maybe, the thing I am least ashamed of, depending on which way you turn it in the light. I didn't go to them. I stood there and I did the arithmetic of my own wood, my own beans, my own 37 head of cattle and my one old dog and my own thin chance of seeing spring. And the numbers said that if I went out into that white to drag the Prouts back here, I might die in the trying. Men died walking shorter distances than that in storms gentler than this. And if I made it, I'd be feeding 3 more mouths and a baby off stores that wouldn't last me alone. The numbers said stay. I have spent 40 years arguing with those numbers. They were not wrong. That's the terrible part. A coward and a coward's arithmetic can both be correct, and you can still be damned by them. I was reaching for my coat to go anyway. I want that on the record. I had my hand on my coat. I had decided to die a fool rather than live a man who watched a baby's window go dark, when I saw the second light. It came out of the garden. It came out of Marin Vance's crooked walls, a lantern, low and swinging, and it started across the buried fields toward the Prout place. Slow, steady. A small gold star moving through a dark that wanted it dead. I watched it go down into a drift and disappear, and my heart stopped, and then it came up the far side and kept on, and I understood that she had seen the Prout window go out too, from her side, 3/4 of a mile off. She'd been watching the same way I'd been watching, except she wasn't standing at a window doing arithmetic. She was already walking into the storm. I went after her. Of course I went after her. A man can be a coward right up until the moment somebody shows him what he's choosing, and then sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the shame is hotter than the fear. I will not pretend the walk was anything but the worst hour of my life. The cold out there wasn't weather. It was a presence, a thing with intent, and it came at every gap in my clothes like it was looking for me personally. The wind took my breath sideways out of my mouth before I could use it. The snow wasn't falling, it was traveling, a horizontal river of it that erased the world past the end of my own arm. I couldn't see Marin's lantern. I couldn't see the Prout place. I couldn't see my own feet. I navigated by the fence, found the top wire with my mittened hand and followed it. Wire to post to wire, and when the fence ended I navigated by faith and the slope of the ground, and the memory of a road I'd driven 10,000 times in the easy light of easier years. Twice I went down. Twice the soft seductive thought came up out of the cold, just rest a minute, just sit. It's not so bad once you stop fighting it. And twice I got up only because I was too stubborn and too ashamed to let a small grieving widow outwalk me to a dying baby's door. Spite, I'm telling you. Pure spite got me across that field when courage had long since frozen off. I have made my peace with that. Spite is an ugly engine, but it'll run in weather that kills the prettier ones. I came up against the Prout house by walking into it. Literally, my shoulder hit the wall before my eyes found it. And there was the door standing open, snow blowing into a dark room, and there was Marin's lantern on the floor inside. And there was Marin herself bent over the bed where Cora Prout lay gray-faced with the baby clutched against her. Both of them too cold to shiver anymore, which is the bad sign, the sign that means the body has given up on warming itself. Dell was on the floor by the cold stove. He'd been breaking up a chair to burn, and he'd run out of strength in the middle of it, and he was just sitting there in the wreck of his own furniture with an axe across his knees, looking at his wife and child with the flat eyes of a man watching the end come. Wade, Marin didn't even look up, like she'd known I'd come, like she'd counted on it. The baby first, wrap her, inside your coat against your skin, Wade, not the cloth, now. I didn't argue. There was no fool left in me to argue with. I took that baby, she weighed nothing. She weighed like a held breath, and I opened my coat and my shirt to the killing air for the half-second it took to get her against my chest, and the cold of her went into me like a blade, and I welcomed it. I wanted it. I wanted to give her every degree of heat I had. She didn't cry. That was the worst of it. A baby that cold doesn't cry. "We can't stay," Marin said. She had Cora half upright, was forcing her arms into Dell's coat over her own. "There's no wood here and no time to make heat. We carry them. To the garden." Dell looked up from the floor. 3/4 of a mile, he said. His voice was a dead thing. "In that, with them like this, we won't make it." And Marin Vance straightened up in that freezing dark, a small woman in her dead husband's coat with snow in her hair, and she said the thing I have carried every day since. She said it quiet. She said it the way you state a fact, not the way you make a speech. "We will make it," she said, "because I did not spend 2 years building a warm place in this valley so that the only people in it would be me. I don't fully remember the walk back. The mind protects you from some things by closing the shutters. I remember the baby against my chest and the terror that she'd gone too still. I remember Marin ahead of me with Cora's arm over her shoulders, the 2 women lurching through drifts that came to their thighs, and I remember thinking the widow was the strongest creature I had ever seen, and being unable to square that with the word folly I'd let myself say about her. I remember Dell behind us, stumbling, falling, getting up, falling, getting up, and once I remember him going down and not getting up and Marin turning back into the wind to scream his name until he answered and rose. I remember the light. The light is what I remember most. Because for a long while in that white there was no light, there was nothing. There was just the wind and the wet weight of the woman ahead of me and the cold ghost of a baby against my heart. And I had stopped believing in the garden the way you stop believing in summer in the middle of February. And then the drift fell away under us and we came down a slope I half remembered, and there, low and gold and steady and impossible, was the light. The crooked walls of the garden caught us before the wind could finish us. That's the first thing I understood, stumbling in among them. Those mad curving stone walls, the ones we'd laughed at for enclosing nothing, they broke the wind. They didn't block it. They broke it, turned it. Set it spinning against itself so that inside the spiral, in the cupped heart of it, the air went suddenly, shockingly still. After 3 days inside a screaming I had stopped being able to hear, the silence in the lee of those walls hit me like a sound of its own. I actually staggered with it. And it was warm. Not warm like a stove, warm like a cellar, warm like the inside of a held hand. The drifts that had buried the rest of the valley had banked up against the north faces of her mounds and her walls and become a blanket. Snow is a blanket. I know that now. Every fool in the valley knows it now, but she knew it 2 years early. And the stone she'd hauled from her dead husband's quarry had been soaking up what little sun there'd been before the storm and was giving it back slow, all day and all night, the way stone does. The whole garden was a thing she'd built to hold heat the way a cistern holds water. And in the heart of it, dug down below the frost line, roofed with the schoolhouse glass, sat the sunken greenhouse with its black barrels, and the barrels weren't doing nothing. They never had been. They were full of water, and water holds heat longer than near anything, and she'd painted them black to drink the sun, and they stood down there in the green-smelling dark, giving off their stored warmth degree by patient degree into a space where, I swear before God, things were still growing. She got us down into it. Cora and the baby first, laid on a pallet between the warm barrels with kale and chard standing green around them like a congregation, and Marin put the baby to Cora's chest and built up the small, clean fire in the little stone and clay stove she'd made, a clever thing. It burned almost nothing and threw its heat into a mass of stone that held it for hours. And slowly, the baby came back. The shiver came back into her first, and I have never been so glad to see a thing tremble. And then, then she cried. That thin, furious newborn wail, the sweetest, ugliest, most alive sound I have ever heard, and Cora started weeping into the baby's blanket, and Del folded down onto the floor beside them with his face in his hands and his big shoulders shaking. And I stood there at the edge of it, snow melting off me into the warm green dark, and I was crying too, an old hard man crying like a child. Because I had watched a window go dark, and I had done my coward's arithmetic, and the answer should have been 3 dead on the Bellwether Road. And it wasn't because of her. Marin wasn't crying. She was working. She was always working. She moved through her green, warm world, checking on the chickens murmuring in their banked coop, drawing water from the cistern that ran beneath all of it through the crooked stone veins of her design, breaking off leaves and pressing them into Cora's hands. Eat. You need it. Eat. And when she finally stopped, when she finally stood still for a moment in the gold light with her face turned away from all of us, I saw her shoulders go down, just slightly, just for a breath, the only crack she let show, and I understood something that broke my heart clean in two. She hadn't built this place to survive a blizzard. She'd built it to survive grief. She'd built it the way I count and the way Lottie planted irises, because when the thing you loved stops growing forever, you have to put your hands into something that won't. Every stone she'd hauled was from Tomas's quarry. Every wall was a way of being near the thing that killed him without letting it kill her too. The whole impossible garden was a 2-year argument with the dark, a woman saying no to it 1 stone at a time alone, while we laughed. And the night the dark came for the whole valley, the only place warm enough to live in was the place she'd built to keep herself from dying of sorrow. I went and stood beside her. I didn't say anything clever. I'd run clean out of clever somewhere in that field. I just stood there, an old fool, and after a while I said, Tomas was right, about me. My voice cracked on it. I see things. I just never say what they add up to. She didn't look at me, but she reached over in the warm green dark, and she put her hand flat against my arm, the same gesture I'd seen her make against the side of the truck that brought him down the mountain. Steadying, saying goodbye to something or hello to something. Say it now then, she said. So I did. I'll tell you what I said and what it cost her to hear it, and who came scratching at the garden walls before the night was through, half the frozen valley, it turned out, every soul who'd laughed at the Gopher farm, crawling through the white toward the only light left in the last part. Because the storm wasn't done with us. And the hardest thing Marin Vance did that winter wasn't building the garden, and it wasn't walking into the blizzard. I stood there in the warm green dark of the place we'd mocked, with a saved baby crying behind me and the wind I could no longer reach screaming somewhere far above the stone, and I told her what her garden added up to. I'm a man who counts, so I counted it out loud, the way I'd never let myself count anything that mattered. The walls don't enclose anything because they're not fences, I said. They're a wind. You shape them to spin the storm against itself so the middle stays still. The stones from the quarry because quarry stone's dense. It holds the day's heat and gives it back at night slow, like a banked fire that never goes out. You painted the barrels black so they'd drink the sun, and you filled them with water because water holds warmth longer than anything else a poor woman can get her hands on. And you sank the glass house below the frost line so the earth itself would keep it. You ran every gutter and channel downhill to one cistern, so you'd never want for water even buried. You banked the coop with dirt so the birds would warm it and it would warm them. You planted the hardy things in October because they'd root before the cold and stand through it. You built the little stove to throw its heat into stone instead of up a chimney. I had to stop. My throat had closed. You built a thing that holds on to warmth and light and water and life the way the rest of us only ever managed to hold on to our pride. And we laughed at you. I laughed at you. In the feed store. I'm telling you so you know. I was one of them. She was quiet a long moment. The barrels ticked, giving off their heat. The baby's crying had eased to a snuffle. I know you were, she said. I heard you. Lord, that landed. I'd hoped, coward to the last, that maybe she hadn't, that maybe my one laugh had been lost in the crowd of them. But she'd heard it. She'd carried it. And she'd walked into a blizzard for the Proots and let me stagger along behind her anyway. Why'd you let me come then? I asked. Tonight, you knew it was me behind you in that field. Why'd you let me into this? She turned and looked at me, and her gray eyes had something in them I hadn't earned and didn't deserve, and have spent 40 years trying to. Because I didn't build this to be right, she said. Everyone thinks that's what I want now, to be proved right, to stand on my walls and watch you all freeze and feel the satisfaction of it. Her voice was very level, but her hands had curled at her sides. I have thought about it. God forgive me, on the worst nights I dug those pits and I thought about exactly that. The whole valley laughing, and then the whole valley needing me, and me with the only warm door in 40 miles. She drew a breath. Tomas would have been ashamed of me for thinking it. Tomas would have understood it, I said. It's a human thought. It's a poison one. She looked at the Proots on the pallet at the baby. I built this to hold life. If I use it to weigh out who's earned warmth and who hasn't, if I turn it into a courtroom, then it stops being the thing I built it to be and starts being a thing the cold built, using me. She said it like she'd argued it out 1,000 times alone in the dark, which I suppose she had. I won't give the cold that, not after everything it's already taken. And that was when the scratching started at the wall. They came all night. That's the part nobody who wasn't there can quite believe. Word of a thing travels even through a blizzard, if the thing is desperate enough. Maybe somebody had seen us cross the field with the Proots. Maybe it was just that every soul in the valley had been watching that one steady light the same way I had, doing the same cowardly arithmetic, until the arithmetic ran out, and the only column left was the warm places over there. They came 1 and 2 at a time out of the white, half dead, frostbitten, following the only glow in the world toward the garden they'd named the Gopher Farm. Earl Dorsey came. The feed store man who coined the CRUELEST names for her place crawled the last 50 yards on his hands and knees with his fingers frozen white and his pride frozen off entirely. And he wept when the still air hit him in the lee of her walls, wept like the baby had. And Marian Vance took his ruined hands and put them in a basin of cistern water she'd warmed, and she said not one word about the Gopher Farm. Not one. She had it in her to say it. We both knew she did. She didn't. The HENDRYS came, the family she'd bought the schoolhouse glass from. The DORSCY boys. Old Mrs. ALDOUS from the Bellwether Crossroads, who told everyone the Vance woman was digging her own grave. She came wrapped in 3 quilts and barely breathing, and Marian laid her between the warm barrels next to Cora and the baby like they were her own kin. By the deepest part of that night, there were 19 people down in a sunken greenhouse built for one grieving widow's vegetables, breathing green, warm air while the storm tried to murder the world above the glass. And the woman who'd built it moved among us all night long, never resting, never once collecting a debt that every one of us owed her and would never finish paying. She made the food stretch. Cold hardy greens and stored roots and eggs from the banked coop and water from the cistern. It wasn't much. It wasn't a feast, but it was life. It was enough. It was the difference, and there was enough because she'd planned for a surplus she didn't need. A generosity built into the design before she had anyone to be generous to. I think now that was the answer to the poison thought, the one she'd argued herself out of in the dark. You can't be sure your better self will win the argument when the cold's at your door and your enemies are crawling toward your fire. So you settle it ahead of time. You build the extra row of kale in October, when no one's watching and no one's begging, so that when they come, the choice is already made. The warmth is already there. There's nothing left to weigh. She'd decided who she'd let inside the garden 2 years before any of us came scratching. She'd decided everyone. She just hadn't told the storm. The long white broke on the 6th day. It didn't break gentle. It broke the way those storms do, all at once, the wind dropping off between one breath and the next, and then a silence so total it woke the sleepers. And then, through the schoolhouse glass, a light none of us had seen in most of a week. Sun. Thin and cold and gold, low in a sky scrubbed to a hard, clean blue, lying across a valley buried 4 feet deep and glittering like the floor of heaven. We climbed up out of the garden into it, 19 survivors blinking like things born underground, and we stood on Maren Vance's crooked warm walls and looked out at a white silent world, and not one of us said a word for a long time. Down the Bellwether Road, the Pruitt house sat dark and dead under its drift, the door I'd left open packed solid with snow. My own place stood a mile off, smoke gone from the chimney. The fire had finally died while I was here, and 3 of my cattle with it I'd learn later. But the people were alive. Everyone who'd reached the light was alive. Earl Dorsey stood next to me on the wall with his bandaged hands, and he opened his mouth, and I thought he was going to say something fine and false, the kind of thing a small man says to paper over a debt he can't pay. But he didn't. He just looked at Maren, who was below us already back at work, breaking the ice off the cistern intake so the melt would run clean, and he said, very low to nobody, to himself, to her, "We didn't know." And from down in the garden, not looking up, Maren Vance said the truest thing I ever heard one human being say to another. "You didn't want to know," she said. "That's different." And she went on chipping at the ice. It wasn't cruel, that's the thing. There wasn't an ounce of cruelty in it. She wasn't keeping score, she'd given it up on purpose, row by row in the planting. She was just declining to let us off easy, because letting us off easy would been one more way of lying to ourselves, and she'd built her whole hard, beautiful life as an argument against the lies we tell ourselves to stay comfortable. You didn't want to know. I've turned that over for 40 years. She was right. We hadn't. It's easier to laugh at a thing than to ask it to teach you. It costs nothing to mock and everything to learn, and we are a people who like a bargain. I went home that afternoon across a valley I could finally see. I buried the cattle I'd lost when the ground thawed in April. I patched the fences. I went on being a rancher and a widower and a man who counts. But I went back to the garden too, all that spring and the spring after. I asked her to teach me, stood at the crooked path with my hat in my hands like a schoolboy, the question I'd swallowed 2 Novembers before finally let out of my mouth. Show me, teach me. How does it hold the heat? How does the wind turn? Why the black barrels? And she did. She taught me, and she taught the Pruitts, and she taught the Dorsey boys, and by the next hard winter there were 4 warm gardens in the valley built on her design, and the winter after that a dozen. We stopped calling it the Folly. We stopped calling it anything. It just became the way you built in Harrow Creek if you wanted to live. Sunk low, banked with earth, walled to break the wind, stone to hold the sun. A widow's grief turned by her own 2 hands into the shape of survival and given away to the people who'd laughed. She never remarried. I want to be honest and say there were years I wished she would, and not for her sake. But Maren Vance was not a woman who needed completing. She was the most whole person I ever knew. She lived another 31 years on the Bellwether Road, and her garden fed half the valley through every bad winter of them. And when she died, in her sleep, in spring, with the kale already up, the whole town came. The whole town, every soul, the ones who'd laughed and the children of the ones who'd laughed. And we buried her up the slope above the garden where she could see the glass catch the morning. I'm the last one left now who remembers the laughing. That's why I'm telling you. so it doesn't die with me. So you know that the warmest thing in the coldest place I ever stood was built by a woman we mocked for building it, and that she let us in anyway, and that she never once made us pay, and that the not making us pay was the genius of it, even more than the stone and the glass and the black barrels drinking the sun. There's an old brass coat button in my pocket as I write this. It was my wife's. I've rubbed it smooth as a creek stone over 50 years of not knowing what to do with my hands. And there's a lantern in my window, burning, the way I keep it every February, low and steady and gold, the way hers burned across the buried fields the night the easy world ended. I tell myself I keep it lit out of habit, out of grief, out of an old man's nonsense. But that's another lie I tell to stay comfortable, and she taught me to hear those in myself. The truth is I keep it burning in case there's someone out there in the white tonight, doing their cowardly arithmetic at a freezing window, who needs to see one warm light and know that the door is open, and that nobody inside is keeping score, and that the warmth was laid by long ago in the autumn by hands wiser than mine.